Beloved guests, one of the great gifts we've received at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture and the Youth Ministry Institute has been the blessing of the talents of students who come to Yale Divinity School. And one of those very gifted students is Barrett Getz, who is on our team and has agreed to lead worship. And I am reliably informed that one can worship while standing in line. So I'm going to turn that over to Barrett. Thank you, Barrett.
Good afternoon. Many of us have been drawn into the presence of the Lord and drawn deeper into the life of the Trinity through musical worship. But we know from Scripture that worship is not just musical, it's what we offer with our whole lives. So I'm going to begin us with a word of worship this morning. And our text this morning comes to us from the band The Brilliance. And would you join with me in joyful prayer and reflection as I read to you the lyrics of their song, Brother. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother. Forgiveness is the garment of our courage, the power to make the peace we long to know. Open up our eyes to see the wounds that bind all of humankind. May our shudder hearts greet the dawn of life with charity and love. When I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother. Let us pray. Lord, we thank you for the bounty of good food that nourishes our bodies and strengthens our hearts for the task ahead. We ask now that you would send your Spirit upon each beloved individual gathered in this room today, that you would open our hearts to see you in one another's faces and open our hearts to receive the wisdom and teaching of the people that you have given us today. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the last lecture of the semester. My name is Jonah Heiser. I'm the program coordinator here at the Yale Youth Ministry Institute, and it is hard to believe that we're already at the end of the year. This is the last semester, or the last lecture of 2018, but have no fear, we have 3 lectures scheduled for the spring of 2019. Please feel free to take the flyers that are on your tables. The first one coming up is February 6th. It'll be Dr. Matthew Crossman on what's worth wanting. So please get it on your schedules, your calendars, and we look forward to seeing you again then. I also want to draw your attention to our online presence. We have, the Yale Youth Ministry Institute has a wonderful website. We're on YouTube. The lectures and interviews are all on our YouTube page. We have a Facebook page where we publish weekly kernels of content, little information, little clips from our interviews and lectures. So please like us on Facebook, like us on Instagram and Twitter, and check out our YouTube page. And we want to stay in touch with you in whatever ways that we can. So our lecture today is Dr. Miroslav Volf and Mr. Paul Gorrell. I'm going to let Skip introduce Miroslav a bit in a minute, but with him is Paul Gorrell, who is a poet and the founder and director of Peace Right Here, which is a nonprofit organization that works to recover and reshape imaginations to embrace, practice, and champaign alternatives to violence. So would you please join me in welcoming up Skip Masbeck, who will say a word about Miroslav Volf.
The overused rubric is, and now I offer you someone who needs no introduction. And now I'm going to give you the introduction. And Miroslav needs no introduction, so I will not introduce him except by sharing two vignettes with you. The first vignette is, just look at this room and what we've experienced over the last 7 years, the community that's gathered around caring passionately for our youth and learning with and from one another. I've been hoping and dreaming of this since 1997 and came up to Yale repeatedly to offer it, always to be told no. But Miroslav said yes. The only reason we're receiving this food, the only reason we have this initiative, the only reason we have this community is because Miroslav made space for us in the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and here we are. So somewhere along the line, you can send him a thank you note for what we've experienced. The second is I want to share a vignette with you from my days as a pastor. Miroslav was working on a book that became, it was commissioned by the Archbishop of Canterbury as the Worldwide Anglican Communion Reading for Lent. And he was working on it 2001, 2002. It eventually was published as free of charge. And he was kind of working some of the ideas out and kind of focus grouping them in lectures at my church. And he was lecturing on forgiveness. Now, this was 2002, and it was in a community just outside New York City where most of the folks who worked for a living worked in the financial industries, and most of them had a close friend, brother, cousin who died in the World Trade Center. This was a very, very raw wound. When we did the worship service on the Sunday after 9/11, when we closed the doors because we had exceeded the fire codes, there was a double-file line that went 300 yards down the hill waiting for the next service. And the prayer time over joys and concerns had 55 names of people who had perished, from brothers and sisters, etc. Miroslav is talking about the unconditionality of forgiveness and the universality of convenience, and there was a fellow in the back pew getting more and more agitated. And when we got to Q&A, he stood up shaking. And he said, "Professor Volf, you have said that Jesus forgives all. I ask you, sir, are there not some crimes too heinous for Jesus to forgive? What would Jesus say to the terrorists who flew those planes into the World Trade Center?" You know the expression cheaply used, "it's too soon"? It was way, way, way too soon. And the air went out of the room. And there are a lot of ways to finesse the answer to that question that would be theologically correct, but not too provocative. Miroslav kind of gulped a little bit. And he said with resolutely, but at the same time pastorally, "Sir, I believe Jesus Christ died on the cross for those men." What a gift to us to have this body of reflection and scholarship for the past multiple decades on the question of forgiveness share with us today. I ask you to welcome my friend, Miroslav Volf.
Can I do something with this, or does this have to be there? No? Oops. I just need a little. Sorry. Well, good day to you, my friends, and I'm very sorry that some of you are still standing, and it looks like if you want to be in this room, you will have to continue standing. But this is a great tribute to Skip. Yeah, he has mentioned that the only reason why these lunches for youth ministers were happening were because I relented to receive them into Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and that absolutely could not be further from the truth. Skip is confusing necessary condition from sufficient condition. And this was a necessary condition, but the sufficient condition, it was by far not. What Skip has done is what I don't think anybody during my time at Yale has done, consistently together as many people to these provocative, interesting, practically also relevant lunches. So that all goes to Skip, and especially I want to thank him because in the context of the Templeton grant, I think we had something like, this is a 34th luncheon meeting of this sort, and there are literally hundreds of people who have attended these, and as it happens, this happens to be the last one in the framework of the Templeton grant. And on that occasion, I want to express my deep gratitude for my friend, former managing director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, who is one of the most eloquent folks on this planet, and I'm glad that he didn't introduce me, because every time after he introduces me, somebody says, even your mother couldn't introduce you better than Skip had. And that's absolutely true. Master of rhetorical exaggeration that is immensely persuasive, as Skip is, but more importantly here, he is a master of gathering folks like you are here and organizing events that have been of tremendous help to church worldwide, in fact, because it's being beamed across the globe, but also here in Connecticut, in our beautiful city of New Haven. So I want Skip to stand up so that we can thank him for all that. We also have a little present for Skip. Oh, there it is. Just so in case he's ever tempted to retire somewhere in his study, this would be a great place to have. We will also be saying goodbye to two other folks without whom these lunches would not be possible. And this is Susan Dos Santos, who is working as I speak, and Siobhan Allen, who is there as well. We have flowers for them, but these would have to probably wait to be properly received because our two marvelous co-workers are too busy to receive them, too busy giving to receive our gratitude. I'm delighted to be able to speak at this event. And to close this series with a reflection on forgiveness and relationship of forgiveness to joy. As I was thinking about speaking, I was flipping through the journals of Father Alexander Schmemann, who has been very important in the work of the center, including giving the title to Matt's and my most recent book, For the Life of the World. And he was writing on May 2nd, 1976, and he was just about to speak at the youth rally outside of Paris and give a lecture, and he said the following: I feel that I would like to pass on a vision which I feel is right, but I do not find any receiving line. And I'm wondering, sometimes that's my experience, especially when I speak to youth, that I myself am not able to find or to create a receiving line, even though stuff that I have to say I feel is important, not just for general population, but specifically for youth. But just because of that, we have here Paul Gorrell, who is going to be the receiving line of the kinds of things that I have to say here about forgiveness. My plan for this short talk that I will give is as follows. Let me see. Let me get my timeline. There we go. Sorry, I know. Where am I in clock? Woo. If I could only know how to work with this thing. Oh, no. There we go. Okay, so my plan is to give you a kind of a brief account of key elements of forgiveness, and then to tie that to the question of joy. As I will say later on, forgiveness and joy, sometimes we can easily imagine how they belong together, but we also have plenty of reason to think why they wouldn't fit well together. This is what I will what I will try to address. And I will give a very brief sketch that I gave of forgiveness that I gave in the book Free of Charge. A series of questions that I will try to answer. But first, just to say that as we all know, we live today in unforgiving times. I have called the culture in which we live in the subtitle of my book as a culture stripped of grace. And today I think it is true even more than it was when I wrote the book. Our times are not times of forgiveness and reconciliation. They are times of name-calling and paybacks, and you can go down the line as well. In most recent this morning reminiscences of G.H. Bush, he was admired for his decency and then also for fostering forgiveness, right? That's not how I have him in memory, but certainly he strikes, one this way today. So let's look at the question of forgiveness. My first question is why forgiveness matters. And forgiveness matters, I believe, because forgiveness seeks to deal with the offense that a person has suffered, and that offense, that injury against me that has occurred, isn't only an injury that has occurred then and there, but it is an injury also that in some way continues to persist in my memory. Memory and forgiveness are very important and belong together. Memory of the injury will be central to the idea of forgiveness, but it is also central to the difficulty of forgiveness. In a sense, it's not that I've just been injured, but I continue to be, in my imagination, injured person. And of course, injury of this sort shapes also relationship that I have to others, especially shapes my relationship to the perpetrator. As it turns out, forgiveness is also necessary not just because we have been injured, but we have very limited ways of dealing with that injury. One way that often is mentioned is punishment, and we all know that punishment does not work in order to address the problem of injury. We also know that time does not run backwards, so that a done deal cannot be undone, and also, notwithstanding the saying that time heals all wounds, time does not heal all wounds, and oftentimes just buries them, and then you have a little bit of winds of conflict, and they flare up. Those memories flare up again, and conflicts becomes alive. So forgiveness matters to us. Second question I want to address is, what is forgiveness? Now, some people think of forgiveness as being simply kind of shrugging off. Injury has happened, and I simply pretend almost as if it had not happened. If I'm particularly strong, it is as if I was going through a corridor and two people passing by have bumped into each other. It would be kind of petty to take seriously that bump and to think that forgiveness is necessary. I'm a strong person. I can simply shrug it off. It doesn't matter that has happened. That was basically Friedrich Nietzsche's account of forgiveness, something of that sort. More popular way in which we understand forgiveness is somehow internal processes by which we deal with a resentment that has accumulated in us as a result of injury that we have received. Forgiveness there is something that happens inside, exclusively inside an injured or wronged person's mind. No doubt, much needs to happen in person's mind for forgiveness to occur, but forgiveness, I believe, is something that needs to happen between the two persons. Injury has happened between two persons, so also forgiveness happens also between people. I sometimes say that forgiveness has a structure of a gift. How does one give a gift? What does it take for gift to be given? Well, you have a person who gives gift, you have a person who receives gift, and you have a gift in the middle. I think the same holds true for forgiveness. You have a person who needs to forgive, you have a person who needs to receive forgiveness, and then there is this act of forgiveness itself. In other words, forgiveness is a social or interpersonal event rather than simply individual event. So if you have been fond or still are fond of watching Dr. Phil, Dr. Phil's definition of forgiveness is something like, I need to figure out how to deal with resentment in order to be able to carry on with my life. Again, this is an important element of forgiveness, but forgiveness itself has this interpersonal dimension. What happens then when we forgive? I think forgiveness has I would put it this way, forgiveness has a presupposition, and then it has a content itself, or a heart of forgiveness. Presupposition of forgiveness is that I name the wrong that has been committed as a wrong, that I identified something as a wrong. That's why, by the way, when you forgive, you always implicitly blame. You always say somebody has done something wrong. If I came to one of you here and said, I forgive you, and you said, wait a second, we never met, what would you have to forgive me? I have implied that somehow I have injured you, and you are immediately resisting the idea. Now, I think that's an essential element of forgiveness, that forgiveness names the wrong as a wrong, but that's a presupposition. The heart of forgiveness is that a person does not count against the other person the wrong that they have committed. Not counting the wrong against is at the very heart of forgiveness. That's the gift that forgiveness consists in. Wronged persons gives a gift to the wrongdoer of not counting their wrongdoing against them. Now that applies not counting them in my actions, not treating actually the other person as such. I believe, and maybe that'll be controversial, I believe that it implies also not treating them as wrongdoer in our imagination. So there's a very much of a personal side to it, as well as, or change of heart, if you want, side of it, as well as transformation of agency. Now, what's the goal of forgiveness if this is the nature of forgiveness? Now, again, if you have a Dr. Phil version of forgiveness, then the goal of forgiveness is something like my internal peace and my ability to go on with my life unhindered by resentment over the injury that has befallen me. I believe that if one thinks of forgiveness as having structure of the gift, somebody gives something to somebody else, that also implies that in forgiving, I do something not simply for myself. I do something also for the person who has injured me. As I will say later, this is going to explain why forgiveness is such a difficult thing to do. So what's the good that I aim to give to the person who has injured me if I have indeed been the one who has been injured? The gift that I aim to give them is ultimately to return them to the good from which they had fallen when they have injured me. I want to, with forgiveness, it's not simply, oh, that's fine, no problem that you've done that. That's why claim that the wrongdoing has been committed is very important, because the whole idea is that that person recognizes the wrong done and returns to the good, desists from evil and returns to the good from which they had fallen. That's why, by the way, apology is essential to forgiveness, because it implies transformation of the wrongdoer. But I think more than just related to something that happens to the other person, forgiveness also has to do with reconfiguring relation between the wronged person and the wrongdoer. We treat each other. The aim is to treat each other in a different way to heal the relationship, rather than simply to each be healed ourselves. Now, my next question is, why is forgiveness so hard? I remember when I wrote my book, prior to publishing it, I think I wrote a few articles on this, and I received a note from a woman who comes from the same part of the world as I do, from Croatia, and who has suffered a great deal, whose family has suffered a great deal during the communist regime there. And basically, she was writing about our then president Tito, and she said, "Let him rot in hell." Now, that's a response to a significant injury that she herself and her family has suffered at the hand of that political regime. In forgiving, you're asked to give a gift, not just to any stranger, but to somebody who has actually done you harm. And this demand of forgiveness, or this feature of forgiveness, makes forgiveness so difficult, especially in situations where injury has been very significant. Misdeed that I've suffered, it lingers. It lingers in my memory. It lingers sometimes inscribed in the very reactions of my body. Even when I don't know that I remember it, my body remembers it and reacts in a particular ways in particular situation. It can sometimes completely define who I am. And the consequences of course, of injury can sometimes be also profoundly impactful. Physical consequences, monetary consequences, psychological consequences, and so forth. Moreover, I think for reasons that we can explain fairly easily, but we don't have to go into, evil somehow is more present to us and more immediate to us than the good. Something evil happened to us, we remember. All sorts of goods are happening to us all of the time, and we think that's how the world ought to be, simply, right? When something that's negative happens to us, it stays in our memory, occupies us, and we know why that might be the case, why that might be also useful for it to be the case. But for that reason also, it is very difficult to forgive. By the way, evil might be predominant in our memory in our experiential memory, but good is more fundamental. And you see that the good is more fundamental is that we presume that the good occurs, and evil ends up in our imagination as an anomaly, right? That's already an indicator of the predominance of the good. Now, my next question, and I have one more after that, and then I'll go to joy. My next question is, why should I forgive? And I think that's a really good question to ask. Perpetrator does not deserve forgiveness. We've already said that when I said that forgiveness is a gift. Nobody deserves a gift. A perpetrator certainly does not deserve forgiveness. In fact, we can say that that perpetrator deserves some form of discipline, punishment. Something of that sort would be appropriate if we thought about appropriateness in terms of what people deserve. So then the question becomes, well, why? Why should I do so? And again, Dr. Phil's account of forgiveness is so that I can function in a better way. You're stupid if you don't forgive, right? It may be unjust to forgive, it may be difficult to forgive, but just step back and ask yourself, what does unforgiveness do to you? And then if you are smart, you're going to start yourself on the process of forgiving, because only if you do that will you be released from the hold of evil doing or that you've suffered on your life, and you'll be able to go on with your life. There's truth to this, but I think there is a more profound reason than simply our ability to go on with our lives. I think the more profound reason is that we forgive because this is built into the, you can put it this way, into the structure of into the nature of our very humanity. And I think it's built into the nature of our humanity because we have been created in the image of God who loves unconditionally. And God's unconditional love is a feature of God that cascades through all the acts of God in relation to the world, all the way to the recreation of the world into the home of God. Let me sketch that for you, and then you'll see that both in terms of our origin and in terms of our destiny, forgiveness must be thought of as fundamental to our humanity rather than just important to our functioning. When we ask the question, why did God create the world, the response is God created the world because God loved. When we asked the question, why did God not leave humanity that had fallen from God to go their ways? Why did God save? The response is, again, because God loves, and God loves unconditionally. Why incarnation? Because God loves. Why crucifixion? Because God loves. Why resurrection? Again, very boring reason to any answer to any question is because God loves. Why is it that the aim of God is, how is it that the aim of God with the world, namely to create the world as a home of God for all creatures, can be achieved? Again, the response must be through actions of love, which is to say, therefore, also in the context of transgression, through forgiveness and through reconciliation. So this is fundamental to who God is. Forgiveness is fundamental to who we are, fundamental to the trajectory of our lives. And Luther, some of you know that I'm a great fan of young Luther. Young Luther has said that in the forgiveness, the entirety of the gospel is summed up. Now I come to my next question, which I'm going to conveniently evade. And that's the question, how do we forgive? And the entire responsibility of answering that question lies with my young co-presenter here, Paul. I want to say, in conclusion, a few words about the relationship between joy and forgiveness. First, a few words about joy, and then about relationship between joy and forgiveness. When is it that we rejoice? What are the occasions of joy? We can all name many of them. What unites the individual cases of joy? I think what unites them is when something good happens to us, and something good happens to us in a way that we haven't fully expected that it will. Something more than might be warranted, something more that might be expected, something that we would describe as a blessing, as a gift, something that doesn't come simply as a matter of course. Example that I give is, if you get every month your paycheck, you generally don't rejoice for having gotten that paycheck. You think you deserve that paycheck, and you may rejoice over having a job, that gives you that paycheck, but not necessarily for the paycheck. But when you get a bonus at the end of the year, and I hope many of you will get, now is the time of bonuses, right? I hope many of you will get a bonus. Then you rejoice because something a bit above of what was expected was given to you. And to rejoice then is to celebrate just the experience of such goods, which means, by the way, that joy is not simply a good feeling. And that's the reason why, again, I've said that a few times, that there is no such a thing as a joy pill. There is such a thing as a good feeling pill, right? Lots of folks are actually highly dependent of such good feelings pills. But that's simply creation of good feelings that is irrespective of any state of affairs outside. Joy unites my feeling with some good that has actually happened to me. So now think about this as this is when we rejoice. Now let's return back to forgiveness. Remember also structure of forgiveness. Somebody gives something to somebody else. Wronged person gives the wrongdoer the gift of not counting his offense against him. So there's a potential for joy. There's a good thing that's being done, and that good thing, by the way, has a character of a gift rather than simply pure dessert. So there's a potential for joy, and yet, when we think about forgiveness, predominant emotions are not that of joy. Let me just go with you through some of the emotions that swirl around the process of forgiveness and what precedes forgiveness. So emotions associated with forgiveness. In the immediate aftermath of wrongdoing or violation, in the person who has been wronged, there is anger, there is humiliation, and to the extent that the person blames partly themselves for what has occurred to them, there's also a sense of shame, sense of inadequacy. For the wrongdoer, there is something like pride if morally they identify with the deed they have committed. There may be something like a perverse joy, rejoicing over some exertion of power that that person has had over the victim. Or if we're dealing with somebody who is morally more sensitive, we might have experience of sorrow, a sense of a guilt of the person. Now think of what happens in the act of forgiveness itself, meaning in the interchange that constitutes forgiveness. I've talked earlier about apology. In apology, when a wrongdoer apologizes, what happens then in terms of our emotions? A sense of guilt. Perpetrator might have in giving apology, has a sense of guilt, sense of shame, but also a kind of sense of uncertainty, whether the shame and guilt will be removed by forgiveness, that is a response to apology, or whether that apology will just magnify and publicly display the moral wrong in which the person has, as a perpetrator, finds himself. Or take a victim who is hearing apology. There's a sense of also uncertainty, possibility of public recognition of the injury, and that's often what victims need and require, public recognition. But there's also suspicion of being duped. The apology may be false. The apology may be manipulative, as we have experienced many of the public apologies. They're public relations stunts, right? They're not really apologies, right? And there's always a possibility, not just in the public life, but very much in the personal life. Somebody is doing another injury to me by apologizing to me, right? And so the kind of suspicion of that is always there. Now, look at it from the side of the victim, the one granting forgiveness. Victim, if it goes well, a victim might have a sense of agency, sense even of moral pride and moral upper hand over the perpetrator. They have suffered the injury, and now they have a power to either release or retain the forgiveness from the wrongdoer. And if they do, they have not just been morally in the right when they were injured, they're doubly morally right in being generous to the perpetrator, right? There can be a sense of strong agency. And by the way, I think that's one of the reasons why victims often do forgive, because it gives them a sense of moral worth and agency, whereas where their acts of aggression has basically taken that agency from them. There is also a victim can give or forgive in a very manipulative way as well, with contempt for the perpetrator. And there can be kind of a fear that the goodwill of forgiveness will be completely wasted. So the many, as I indicate here, many difficult emotions swirl around the process of forgiveness. It's possible, for instance, that the perpetrator might also feel a sense of gratitude, or we are hoping that the perpetrator might feel a sense of gratitude for forgiveness, even joy at being forgiven and guilt being lifted. And yet, if something goes wrong, it's also possible that there's a sense of humiliation and sense of false indebtedness toward the one who forgives. In this, giving you kind of emotional tonality of what might happen when we forgive, I've sketched the complexity of forgiveness. And we are both attracted and hesitant about forgiveness just because of such, because it's so weighted in this emotionally, sometimes negative ways. And so finally, I come to the end and have to ask, well, where's joy in the forgiveness at all, if you can find it? Obviously, when forgiveness goes well, for the perpetrator, there is a release from guilt that results in joy. There is a kind of beginning of a new life. Instead of walking with a tattoo on the forehead with regard to the victim, wrongdoer all the time, and being awareness of one's own guilt, there is a sense of burden being lifted, of slate being wiped clean, and the idea, the sense that I've betrayed my own humanity, violated somebody else, that has been lifted from me. That's a great occasion for joy. And for a victim, well, there's a sense that maybe that I have acted, victim has acted in accordance with my humanity. That's kind of a joy in the good that I perform, I was able to perform, that I have contributed to this person being returned back to the good from which they have fallen. And then finally, for both the victim and the perpetrator, forgiveness given and received is a way of returning back to the home, so to speak, of our humanity. Each is at home with themselves, and each is at home with the other. The story from Luke 15, story of the prodigal son, indeed, that entire chapter is the greatest chapter in the Bible about joy. And it illustrates joy of forgiveness. The prodigal is returning to himself when he comes back as the son of that father, member of that family. The father is also returning to himself, no longer father of the prodigal, but the father of the son that has been reconstituted as the son in a proper sense of that term. And both are part of a home together. And then all celebrate, except for those who do not believe in forgiveness, as we know in that story as well. That's a story of celebration, of forgiveness successfully rendered. And it's really, if you think of how Christian tradition has thought about Luke 15, it is really a story of the entire humanity on a journey to God, and in that journey to God, of a journey with one another, reconciliation and forgiveness as a source of great joy in heaven and on earth. Thank you very much.
Thought you guys were going to clap longer. My name is Paul Gorrell. I'm happy to be here. This is a gift, and I receive it. Do you receive it? Yeah. I am the founder and director of Peace Right Here. We recover and reshape imaginations to embrace, practice, and champion alternatives to violence. I also work in the community. I work at an AIC. It's Alternative in the Community, and we serve people on probation, parole, people dealing with pretrial sentencing, and I lead intervention groups, and I also lead a team of intervention specialists. Before I came here, I was talking to them, and I said, tell me something that you know about forgiveness. And here's a few of the words that they shared. They said, life is short. It's good to forgive. Apologies really do matter. Love makes it possible. Don't let anger consume you. And this is my favorite. He said, I think it's one of the greatest things. Everyone should be forgiven because as humans we all make mistakes. I think they got it. I think they have it. There's a few other quotes. This is from Miroslav in his book. He says, briefly, God is the God who forgives, and we forgive because God forgives. We forgive as God forgives. We forgive by echoing God's forgiveness. That's a good one. And I think he has an even better one here. It says, Christ is not just outside us, modeling forgiveness and urging us to forgive. Christ lives in us and is himself, as Luther wrote, the basis, the cause, and the source of all our own actual righteousness. I read that and I was like, wow, that's good. That is really good. It seemed to make sense, it's starting to make sense. Where does forgiveness come from? Why is this even possible? It's because Christ is in us. And Christ is the basis, the cause, and the source of all our own actual righteousness. It's not anything that we do. We join God. From Christ we receive the power and the willingness to forgive. Christ forgives through us, and that is why we can forgive. So we're here for youth ministry. If you're a youth minister, I really encourage you to get this book and read it, not just yourself, but in a community. Wrestle with it, talk about what's going on in the pages. Great text. So when we think about forgiveness, we're going to think about it as a process, as a journey. Miroslav uses those words. It just doesn't, it's not a one-time thing. It has a lot to it. And so we're going to walk down a path. I'm going to give you 4 steps, 4 tips, 4 things that I hope make a difference in your world. They're things that I've lived through, and they're good. So here's the first step on the path, and we've already talked about it a little bit. The process of forgiveness is participating with Christ by the power and the prompting of God's Spirit among a community of loving and supportive people. Now, there's a story. Miroslav shared a story in Luke. I'll share a story in Luke too. You might already know this story. This is the story with the friends who had another friend who wasn't able to walk, And so they said, let's bring him to the presence of Jesus. Let's just get him close. Let's see what happens. So they want to get him as close as possible to Jesus. And this is all happening in Luke 5. And then they have this obstacle. The crowd. The crowd was their first obstacle. They said, we can't get too close to Jesus, so what are we going to do? Get a little creative, get a little criminal. Go up on the roof. It's Santa Claus time, right? This is the perfect season. So they're up on the roof, and they have a gift to deliver. They tear apart the roof. They lower him down, and there he is, in the near presence of Jesus. What do they want at this point? What? Healing. They want their friend to be able to. Okay. What does Jesus do? Does anybody remember this story? Forgives him. But then there are people around, they have a problem with that. They say, who are you to forgive? Who are you to forgive? And he says, well, just to show you that I'm authorized, that I'm certified to be able to give this type of forgiveness, let me heal this man. And so he says, get up, take your mat, and go home. And he does. And there is this line, the unimaginable. The unimaginable thing happens, and everybody was moved to joy. Started first with the guy who became able to walk. He was pretty excited about that. And then everyone else around him, they said, wow, that blew our minds. I didn't think that was possible. And it happened. I love this story because we see in it a movement from this community, these friends, and all they want to do is they want to help. They're that loving and supportive, those loving and supportive people I'm talking about right here. And as youth ministers, we need to create environments where we can see love and support happen. Amen? Okay. Now, this is a picture of maybe what that love and support look like for them, but we need other pictures. We need modern pictures. We need pictures with our faces in them. We need pictures with our hands and our bodies doing work. What are those pictures? Who's in them? What's going on? It wasn't easy to carry that person. It was bold what they did. Jesus met this person's need through forgiveness. How many of you got needs? Okay. So we come into the presence of Christ with our needs, and he gives us forgiveness. And then we see healing, and then we see joy. There's also a good line in there. It says, when Jesus saw their faith helped their friend get forgiven. Say, my faith can do something. And it might not just be in my life. You didn't have to say it, but I appreciate it. Maybe your faith just isn't for you. Touch someone and say, it's not just for you. Not just for you. All right. Second step, make room for forgiveness talk and for how difficult the process of forgiveness can be. Make room for it. There are 4 relationships we need to tend to. We need to tend to our relationship with God, the relationship we have with ourselves, the relationship we have with others, and the relationship we have with creation. All these relationships are places where things can go wrong, places where forgiveness is needed. What do you think about that? Do you talk to your young people about anything other than the things that may be going on between them and God or them and others? I mean, do we talk about those other areas of relationship? Sometimes we can ignore the relationship we have with ourselves, or ignore the relationship that we have with all the beautiful things that surround us, the earth, the animals. I'm in trouble. You can save me anytime you want. I do this thing with my groups. I call it looking in the rearview mirror. And when we look in our rearview mirror, we see all the things that are going on in our life, all the things that have gone on. So we look in our rearview mirror, and what do we see? That's my question to you. What do you see? Is there trauma? Is there woundedness? Is there brokenness? Are you reflective about the life you're living, or are you just busy? Because our kids are busy. So we got to make room for talk about it. We got to talk about how it can be difficult. I do some forgiveness flexibility sometimes. You know, if you're exercising, it's good to warm up. So I'll teach you some forgiveness flexibility. Here goes. I was wrong. 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 And then you lean the other way and you say, I forgive you. I forgive you. I forgive you. I bet you know some people who have never admitted that they're wrong. It's hard for them to say. It's annoying, You're like, I see it. Why don't you see it? We just had a discussion about it. Why don't you just say it was wrong, and then we can move forward? And we learned from Miroslav how important those words, like, I was wrong. So practice. Say, I was wrong. I was so wrong. I forgive you. I forgive you. It takes practice. It's called the practice of forgiveness, so we got to practice. Sometimes it's as simple as just warming things up. I was wrong, I was wrong, I was wrong. If we had more time, I could tell you some stories about some guys that we've been able to talk through actually applying forgiveness in their lives. And what it comes down to is looking in the rearview mirror, finding something or someone, and then dedicating time to really saying, God, what are you doing here? What's your intention here? What could your love do here? And then joining in with that work. And as we saw in the first two slides, Christ is doing the heavy lifting. We get to be a part of it. We're going to feel a little bit of that stress, but it's Christ, that basis, that cause, that source. The next step, let's listen to the stories of others and learn how they practice forgiveness. Just up the road, there's this organization called OMSC. And I was up there one night, and we were looking at a friend's display of paintings. And so I'm talking with different missionaries, and they're from all over the place. And there was this couple from South Africa. And when I meet people, I start talking like, how do you practice forgiveness? Like, that's a common conversation. How do you lament? Those are things I talk about. And so I'm talking to the South African, and he says, in my community, if I were to wrong an elder, I would lay flat before him or her, and another person would actually have to ask for that forgiveness on my behalf. Miroslav talked about the social nature of forgiveness. What is the community doing? In America, it's very easy to be like, oh, it's my stuff. It's my stuff. I got to deal with me. Well, we just already talked about how our faith isn't just for ourselves, right? And so forgiveness is not just a one-person thing either. It's a team thing. It's a family thing, right? When you wrong someone or when someone wrongs you, it doesn't only affect you. It's got ripples. It goes all through the community. And it takes a community, it takes a village to do this stuff. What will you do to be a leader of that type of community? I think listening to other people's stories helps us gain wisdom. Every time we hear a story, every time that story is received, we widen the circle. We get more depth. We could understand how we could practice forgiveness in our actual lives. The last one is engage the arts and artists to give rendering to forgiveness. And you might have noticed this fellow to the left of me. This is a sculpture created by Owen Burke, who's with us today, my man. Woo-hoo. So, piece right here, we do trainings in nonviolence. We focus on 12 core practices. And one of the things that we're really excited about is this Champion Peace Artist Series. And Owen's the very first artist that we've worked with. And Owen has become a friend. This all started at a skate rink, just talking about life. But But we ended up deciding that we would work together, and he's created 12 sculptures. This is one of them, and it's entitled Forgiveness. And I kind of want to give you some space to look at the picture or look at the statue, whatever you're able to do, and just look at it for a little bit. What do you see? Courage. See courage. What else? Surrender. Momentum? Humility.
Leaning in with his heart.
Leaning in with my heart.
Even though his fists are clenched.
Fists are clenched.
Vulnerability in his nakedness.
Vulnerability in the nakedness. You know, my mom, she wanted to sew, she wanted to sew pants for, I was like, Mom, no. She might be watching. Here we go. In the corner? Vulnerability. Anybody else from this side? Yes. Effort. Okay.
Preparing to cast something, like I think to cast all their anxieties, casting, releasing.
Very good. Yes. Moving forward. Yeah. Could I have a volunteer? Actually, 3. 3 volunteers. We got 1, 2, 1 more. Over here, 3. Come on up. So here's what you're going to do. I want one person to be the sculpture. Who wants to be that person? I'll be the sculpture. Oh, you will? Okay. So take the pose. Okay. Actually, will you move a little bit forward? Yeah, just in case things get rowdy. There we go. Okay. Now, you're the community. What does this... I think your head needs to be down a little bit. There you go. What does this person need? And how will you provide that? How will you help? You don't have to talk, just use your body. Very good. This is another picture. No, what you're doing right here. This is a picture. He's like, another picture, let's see it. This is a picture of the community of God being the community of God, being a community of forgiveness, being a loving and supportive community. How will you enable this as leaders? How will you enable this? Thanks so much for your time.
So we have been working through 34 lectures on this grant for 3 years, trying to capture the intersection of theory and praxis just right. Nailed it on the last one. Nailed it on the last one. Thank you. Thank you for being part of this community. Please come back and continue to be part of this community. I know students need to go to class or finals and papers. Sorry. And folks have to go back to work. We're going to take a 3-minute break so that if you need to leave, you can, with our blessing and gratitude for all you do for our kids. If you can stay, Dr. Volf and Paul will take questions and offer answers. And there's coffee and desserts back there for you to pick up. So if you go with our gratitude. And if you can stay, we'll be back live in a couple of minutes.
So it's nice that even though we talk about it seems to me like it runs in the state. We kind of get going on it just goes until we get to therapy and stuff. I feel like I think I told you I could be too.
May I have your attention? Important matters first. Important matters first. We got a lot of food up there, y'all. I hope you're gonna help yourself to the coffee and the food and receive the hospitality that's offered. And then I want to continue with some Q&A. I think we might have to caffeinate Dr. Volf a little bit for the Q&A section, but we're working on that. What I want to remind you is that it's just amazing. We have people in 110, 120 countries around the world who tune in to the YouTube live stream, and they can't hear your question if you just stand up at your table because you're not mic'd. So it's a little unfair to them. So we have a handheld. If you have questions for Dr. Volf or Paul Gorrell, please just let me know. We'll run the mic to you so that the folks around the world can receive the question as well as the answer. All right, who has questions for our speakers today? Oh, yeah, I thought there might be a question or two.
Thank you for your presentations. Trying to find you in the room. There you are. My question has to do with what both of you mentioned about the importance of apology and contrasting forgiveness and this kind of two-sided process of reconciliation, and wondering how you would speak to, really from a theological lens, circumstances in which there is no apology, where there is no willingness to acknowledge wrongdoing, or there is ongoing wrongdoing or abuse, or, you know, this dynamic in relationships, and how the victim or the one who has been injured makes sense of that, and the duty to forgive, and a lot of this in theological terms. You know, I think that's where some of this, Dr. Phil, like you're released from it by forgiveness, but in this kind of more rigorous understanding of forgiveness, what does that look like when it's not a reciprocal process?
It's obviously very, very important and very relevant question. So if one thinks of forgiveness as a gift, somebody gives something to somebody else, it's possible for the gift to be stuck between a giver who gives and the recipient who won't receive. That happens with gifts. I sometimes give example. My sister sends me a gift, packages, buys, goes to great lengths into it, or I do it to my sister, whichever way you can put it. And I've done it, for instance. And my sister receives that gift, and it sits on her table. And she thinks, what's been going on in the head of my brother? What's he trying to do with this gift? What kind of sin is he surreptitiously trying to the consequences of sin is he trying to evade? And she can have all sorts of reasons why she leaves this gift all wrapped up, beautiful gift, but all wrapped up on her table. Have I given her a gift? Yes, right? But from the other angle, she hasn't received it, so gift is somehow stuck between me, who has given it, and her, who, with good or bad reasons, didn't want to receive it. And I think that's also what can happen with forgiveness. There is value in giving it, irrespective of receiving, but the gift of forgiveness achieves its goal once it is received, and it's received through apology, proper apology, right? That's the circle then of gift of forgiveness comes to its completion. And sometimes it's not possible. People won't receive it. Sometimes people can't because they are not with us anymore. In all these instances, I believe that forgiveness still makes a lot of sense and is an important thing. And by the way, it also reconfigures relationship between you and that person. It's not simply something, Dr. Philish, is that a word? Which is simply happening in yourself with respect to yourself. Rather, it's happening with respect to that person. You're redefining your relationship to them by offering forgiveness. And often forgiveness in many ways, that's one way in which forgiveness is incomplete. And one of the things that I have come to believe is that if you want complete forgiveness and full and clean forgiveness, you won't get any of it, right? It's not an all or nothing thing. It's not an all or nothing thing when I give it, right? I remember forgiving, and then I wake up in the middle of the night and I think, what? Forgive? This is crazy. I can't do that. I can't do that. He doesn't deserve that, or whatever it is in this twilight zone of my consciousness. I doubt what I have done. And then I return back to myself, and I give, I take back, and that's how forgiveness, my apologies, that's how forgiveness often occurs. And I think that's quite right also, because it's not a one-time act. It's a practice into which we live because it defines relationship which we have, ongoing relationship which we have with ourselves, with other people.
Thank you. Hi. So I have a little bit of different opinion on that, in that I think personally that the forgiveness is a gift that I give myself. So if the other person doesn't receive it, if they're dead or they can't receive it for whatever reason, I'm still healing myself of the wound of unforgiveness, which is keeping me separate from other people. So it's the separation that we have with each other that the unforgiveness continues. And when I give the gift of forgiveness to someone else, it's kind of I can see it's somewhat of a selfish act on myself, because I'm actually cleansing and healing myself. And I'm connecting with the other person, even though they might not connect with me, but I am putting it out there. And I think that's what we all want as human beings, is to connect with each other. And if the other person obviously receives it and there is that full the full connection, then that's great. But even if they don't, I think the act of forgiveness is the gift I give myself. What do you think about that?
I think it's so that the process in which I benefit from the work on myself with regard to the injury that I have received, I think it's a very important process and needs to be honored. Right? Way in which I deal with resentment needs to be honored. right? And I need to go through this. But maybe we have to differentiate, have two words.
Right, maybe.
One is for what I work, for my work on myself, and other is what redefines the relationship to the other person, right? One would be the gift that I give to myself, or I would probably, there's something paradoxical about giving gift to oneself. I would say work that I do on myself, from which I benefit, and the gift that I give to somebody else. Both would be important, but the two would be distinguished. And I tend to reserve that word forgiveness for this interpersonal, what happens between people, or what happens in me with regard to that person, aiming to reach them so that the relationship will be reconstituted.
There is some disempowerment with that, isn't there? Because if you are giving your power over to the other person to receive it or not. And so if I give it freely of myself, it's an empowering thing that I'm doing, not reliant on how the other person reacts to it or not. Because I'm not giving my power over to them, whether the gift occurs or not. I don't know.
Yeah, so any act of grace, I think, entails a risk. Any act of love actually entails a risk. I give power to another person when I love them over my destiny. In a sense, I have entrusted my life to them, and if I am unwilling to risk, I'm going to remain alone. Kind of this existential risk of giving of oneself to somebody else is fundamental, I think, to our humanity. And I think that forgiveness might be one mode in which that happens.
Miroslav, nice to see you again.
We saw each other often on the pitch. We played soccer together, Paul and I.
Talk about forgiveness.
You're right. Oh, what do you remember? My God.
I guess I was struck in both of your presentations that about a phrase an old friend said to me, love is a series of decisions, where it feels like forgiveness is the same. It tracks along the same trajectory. That it's not just, as you said, you wake up at night thinking, oh my God, I just forgave this person, do I really mean it? You know, it's sort of a place you have to work toward.
Yeah, I agree, and in theological literature, it's often then described as a practice, rather than even series of decisions, right? So not one decision, not multiple decisions, though many decisions are involved, but also some kind of a practice, that is to say, even a skill that one learns, and that accompanies one through one's life.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yes, thanks so much. I have two thank yous and a comment, actually. First thank you is thanks for quoting Father Schmemann, whom I have so much respect for and admiration. And second, thank you for characterizing forgiveness as a gift. It seems to me that and please correct me if I'm thinking wrong, that the gift has to be unconditional and not a quid pro quo, meaning you give the gift, not expecting it to be accepted, or expecting a gift in return. Now that may work and may not work depending on who's talking or who's thinking or who's feeling. And my comment is I really enjoyed the action with the statue because it kind of resolved this issue by having an agency, by having a third party, let's call it the community or family or someone who's going to mediate. I think it's extremely helpful. So gift and mediation or agency, I think combined, are a wonderful way of forgiving.
I agree on all of this, especially on the last point. I think this was a very powerful illustration of the place of the community. And so in a sense, I talked about structure of the gift, but there is a kind of entire support to that structure of the gift, which Paul's presentation illustrated really, really well. On your previous point, just very briefly, there are two traditions, two strands in the Christian tradition of thinking about forgiveness. One is that it is predicated on apology, right? And the other is that it is strictly unconditional, right? So the one is that forgiveness is unconditional, but its completion in the form of reception is conditioned on apology, and the other one is first step is apology, and the response ends up being forgiveness. Good arguments can be given for both of these. I tend to think I'm very much, or no, I shouldn't say I tend to think, I'm very much in favor of unconditionality of forgiveness, but I think we need to honor the fact that there are important thinkers, Christian thinkers, as well as in Judaism and in Islam, that emphasize priority of apology, or at least temporal priority of apology over the forgiveness.
Thank you both for your presentations. Thought both were phenomenal and incredibly impactful. Had a question actually for you, Paul. You started leading us through the process of interacting with one piece of art, that was intentionally designed to be about forgiveness. I guess my question is, so aside from interacting with one piece by Owen Burke, right? Like, is there a curated library of art on forgiveness? Would you suggest looking for art that evokes something of forgiveness? Yeah, I just love more of a sense as to kind of like how you were imagining interacting with art and forgiveness.
I like that question. I made mention that Owen and I at a skate party started talking, and I had always had this idea of what if we could work with different artists, and we would have artists from all different areas of the world who had all different ways of doing their art, all different medium. Wouldn't that be interesting? What would we learn from that? So when I said engage the arts and artists, I really do, I want to see new work. I want to see new creations. I want to see investment in artists, and I want it to be a thing that brings life to the church. I want it to be something that helps us understand the very difficult things like forgiveness. I mean, what do they say? If you don't have words, you have a picture that's worth 1,000 or however many words. If you can't say something, you dance about it. We have all these ways of communicating things that seem to be beyond us. And I think the arts are a great on-ramp. So in terms of a library, I want to create one. I want to work with artists of all different sorts. And if there's anybody here who could help me, we'd love to do that. But seriously, I want new work, and I want to hear voices that haven't been heard. How many people have heard about the situation that I described with the South African and how they practice forgiveness? Any hands? You have? 2 hands? Okay. Well, there's a lot of people in here, and we've had 2 hands, 3 hands with mine. What a blessing that is. We see in the postures of the person lying down on the ground humility. And we realize that even though I might not lie down on the ground, I will have humility when I give forgiveness and when I receive forgiveness. We see also with the additional person mediating that it's not just about me. And so that, even though I'm not a South African in that community, I realize there's more to this.
Hi. Again, thank you both. This has been wonderful. I wonder if you have any thoughts on an observation that I have in terms of working with young people and being a father of 3 teenagers, is when I say I'm sorry, or when they say I'm sorry about something, the tendency is, in our society, the one I'm in anyways, is not to say I forgive you. It's to say, oh, no problem, or it was nothing, or sure. But I rarely hear the words, I forgive you, when somebody apologizes. And I even spoke with some therapists about this. And they said, oh, is that important to you that they say, I forgive you when somebody apologizes? And I said, I think it changes things. Yeah, as opposed to, and so I think, I don't know if this is an aversion to the vulnerability of saying I forgive you or what. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
It's a wonderful question, and I haven't reflected upon it very much. My intuition would be to say something important is lost by not saying forgive me. I'm wondering whether never mind, no problem, whatever else is being said of this sort, whether it's an attempt to relieve the person of the seriousness of what they perceive that they have done, and kind of simply let it. So reception of forgiveness might be seen too much, or giving of forgiveness might be seen too much of a accusation toward the other person. Why we're uncomfortable with that may be an interesting thing to explore, if that's really what's going on. But I think it's something very important that you pointed out, and anybody else, if you have reflected on it, or I would like to urge any students to reflect on it, and cultural analysis would be really interesting in this regard.
10th paper due January 15th? Excellent.
One of the responses you shared was someone saying it's nothing. But that's not really true, is it? It's a great thing. My response is that you would always stand for truth, even in moments like that. Have the adequate value for what Christ is doing in that moment. It's not just what I'm doing. It's not just what you're doing. This is something that that you join with Christ in. And so to undervalue it is to undervalue the work of Christ.
I was wondering if either of you could talk about how to delineate the difference between forgiving and enabling. And one of the examples I'm thinking of is some of the discussion after the Charleston church shooting. There was this profound act where the families of those church members offered forgiveness to the shooter, and then there was an immediate pushback that it was too quick, too easy of forgiveness, and some activist circles said that we're talking about sort of as you said, the Christian narrative is that forgiveness is unconditional. And so how do you figure out, is this a profound act of forgiveness, or is this an act of enabling?
If one conceives of forgiveness as, if one thinks that saying I forgive you, or giving forgiveness, gift of forgiveness in my terms, is all that is required for the process of forgiveness to come to its completion, it may be experienced that way. But I think we have to think of forgiveness as a more complex. It has to be received also as a gift. Moreover, I have tried to argue in free of charge that forgiveness is not incompatible with punishment, that in fact it sometimes requires it. What forgiveness is incompatible with is retribution or retributive account of punishment. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, or whatever kind of payback you want to design. Forgiveness is incompatible with that stance. But forgiveness and disciplinary action, forgiveness and ensuring that the perpetrator understands fully what he or she has done to grow into their better selves is, I think, completely compatible, indeed, ought to be combined with forgiveness. I do it all the time with my kids. I don't understand why we wouldn't do it otherwise in our relationships, and I think a mature offender who receives forgiveness would welcome the forms of punishment that would lead, or forms of discipline that would lead them into coming back into his own as a human being, or her own as a human being.
Thank you, and thank you to Miroslav and to Paul. My apologies if you have additional questions, but it segues to an appeal. The reason we have to leave right now is we have we're already late for a 2 o'clock appointment at the Yale Broadcast Center, where we interview each of our speakers in 3- and 4-minute clips on the key portions of their presentation. Those clips are all then available on our Facebook page, and they come out every Monday and Wednesday, with each week having a theme, kernels of content for Yale. So I'm ending with a raw sales pitch. Please come back, continue to be part of the community, and look for their work today at the interviews on Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you.